Does the Bible teach that there are other gods? And the answer to that question is entirely in the air quotes. Now, you brought up exegesis, but this is not an exegetical issue. This is actually a linguistics issue, and I think you might be responding to something completely different than what I actually said. So if you go back to my video, what I said is stop saying that other gods don't exist. And then I contextualized how I was using that word by saying that gods, as in the representation of spiritual entities in heavenly realms, which is also how Scripture uses the word gods, and it uses it in many other contexts as well, including one where Paul actually says that a person has made their belly their god, which obviously doesn't mean that he made their belly into a spiritual entity, but rather that they had elevated it to a status that was well beyond what was appropriate. But the word that he uses in the New Testament is theos. It's the exact same word that's used for God. The difference is the modifier, which basically is the air quotes, and that creates the context for how you understand the word. Just like in the Old Testament, the word Elohim is the same word that's used for God and gods, but how you would interpret that word all depends on the modifier. So, for example, in Genesis it says Ha Elohim, which means the one true God, as opposed to Elohim, which could mean little g God. It could mean many gods. As you aptly pointed out, it could also mean judicial authorities. It doesn't always have to reference to spiritual authorities and powers. And it could even be used metaphorically in exactly the way that Paul used it in the Old Testament, using Elohim as opposed to theos, which would be used in the New Testament. Now, I am not an expert in ancient languages, so if somebody who's watching this video is actually an expert in ancient languages, and I've used the word Elohim or represented the word theos incorrectly, please feel free to correct me in the comments. But for the sake of this response, I would say, honestly, I don't think it matters, because I wasn't making an argument based on the utilization of Hebrew or Greek, but rather I was making a commentary using English. And in English, the word God and gods is entirely neutral, and very similarly, at least as far as my reading takes me, to the way that Hebrew and Greek use it. It's a neutral term that can be used to represent any number of things, and it always has to do with elevation, like how you've elevated a thing to a certain place. Now, you said that word choice matters, which I absolutely agree with you. Word choice matters very much. And that's why I used the word gods in this context, because I was essentially taking a similar position that Paul took whenever he was dealing with the people of Athens. So if you read in Acts, there's this story where Paul goes to the temple and he tells the Athenians, he says, I notice that you're very religious and you seem to have an altar for basically every god that exists, including an unknown God. And then he says, the one that I am preaching to you is that God, the unknown God. Now, does that mean that Paul is putting Adonai God at the same level of the pantheon of gods that the Athenians were worshiping? No, of course not. He was making the point that amongst the spiritual entities that the Athenians are worshiping, there is one who stands above all of those, and that would be Adonai God. Which attends to the point that I was making in my original video, is that oftentimes, at least in my experience of faith and people of faith, there has been this movement towards saying that all of these other gods or spiritual powers or entities that are represented with names like Allah, Krishna, Buddha, things like that, don't exist. But like Paul, I disagree with that argument. I believe they absolutely do exist. And just like God exists amongst the pantheon of gods, it's not an issue of existence, it's an issue of hierarchy. Because we know that these spiritual powers and principalities exist, which you even said in one of your latter comments that you don't disagree with. So we know that the spiritual powers and principalities, these things exist. There are these authorities in the heavenly realms that have spiritual power, and many people have worshiped them and called them gods and even given them names. And so the dispute isn't one of existence, but rather it's a dispute of authority. Which God is supreme? And authority has to be backed by power, which is why we claim Adonai God as the one true God, having all power and all authority. He has all authority over all other gods. That means he has the right to do the thing, but he also has the power behind him to back up that authority, which is why all other gods, little g, have to submit to him, because not only does he have the authority, but he also has the power to destroy them. So, to bring this full circle, does the Bible teach that there are other gods? Depends on the context that we're speaking of it in. If we're using the word gods as a general reference for spiritual beings that people choose to worship or elevate to a status of God, then yes, the Bible teaches that there are many beings that people worship as God. But if we're contextualizing it through the lens of the one true God, and we're saying, does the Bible teach that there are other gods that are similar to our God, that have similar power or are in any way competitive for his position? Then no, that's ludicrous. The Bible is very clear. There is only one God, meaning the supreme, only, let's call it only one, the God, right? Only one, Ha Elohim, the one that stands above all, is separate from all. That's one of the reasons that he says, keep my name holy. Holy meaning that he is entirely separate from all other spiritual entities and beings that a person might interact with. He is entirely separate, unlike any other being in existence. There is nothing like him. And so, in that context, no, the Bible absolutely teaches that there is only one God. Now, I think where the confusion may have come for you is maybe you didn't make it far enough into the video to see where I actually contextualized what I was talking about. Or it could have also been in my response. When I brought up Elohim, I recognize that there are people out there who are making a very weird argument about Elohim meaning God's plural. And there's like a whole thing with like the Benai Elohim and everything else. Again, I'm not a scholar in ancient languages, and so this is way outside of my category of expertise, but I know that there's people out here that are making this argument. And so when you see somebody bring up Elohim, it would be reasonable for you maybe to jump to conclusions and think that they're making this argument, which obviously was not the argument that I was making. All of that to say, I hope that clears up any confusion. Based on your comments, I have a feeling we probably are in agreement, and maybe you just misunderstood what the purpose of the video was. But if not, and there's something specific that you actually still disagree with, by all means, please drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Oh, and if you're watching this video for the first time, highly recommend you go back and watch the video that this was in reference to, because the point that I was making, I think, is actually a really important point. So highly recommend that video as well.